Hello and welcome to the Other Underground Railroad. I'm your host, Dr. Jason Nichols, and today we are only a few days removed from Vice President Biden's interview on The Breakfast Club, where he made some comments that many people found to be very offensive about African American voters. He suggested that if you were still making a decision between President Trump and himself, Vice President Biden, that is, that you were not indeed black. Many people found that very condescending and offensive, and understandably so. But Charlemagne the God kind of kept his eye on the prize, and he wanted to talk more about deliverables and about what each campaign is proposing and promising for African American communities. So today, we're going to do a little bit of a deep dive on that subject, actually talk about what each campaign's black agenda is, and go into it, juxtapose it with their records, and see where we stand at the very end. So thank you so much again for logging in and watching the Other Underground Railroad. Click subscribe, click like, have a comment if you like, or if there's something else you expected from this video. We thank you once again for watching. So today we're going to really dive in and try to compare the agenda and records of Vice President Joe Biden and President Trump as far as their black agenda. Now, one of the things that Vice President Biden plans to do is to close the $23 billion funding gap between majority white and majority of color school districts. Now, that comes out to about $2,300 per student. He plans to triple the funding for Title I schools, make public HBCUs tuition free, doubling the maximum value of Pell Grants. Now that's really important because 60% of African American undergraduate students receive a Pell Grant in 2015-16. And he wants to allocate $70 billion for HBCUs, including $5 billion for STEM. Now that's really important because those students who will have that kind of funding and have the access that they to STEM, a good STEM education, will be the doctors and the nurses and the healthcare professionals that will help African American communities. We know that black doctors and black nurses are more likely to serve black patients. And with the COVID-19 pandemic that we're dealing with, having more black health professionals serving black communities will be really important. Also for ridding out a lot of the implicit biases that we find in healthcare. He also wants to double the number of mental health professionals in schools and to avoid the criminalization of black youth. We understand that a lot of things come from trauma, particularly for students who come in from poor neighborhoods that have been destabilized by years of neglect, violence, and things that happen in those communities that are by systemic design. He wants to end the criminalization of the students who may come in and have issues in schools from that and give them the resources that they need to lead productive lives. So that is part of Joe Biden's plan for black students and their education. Now, when it comes to President Trump and his record on education for black students, he rescinded an Obama-era directive for schools not to punish students of color at higher rates than whites, and he planned to cut nearly $9 billion from the education budget. Now, that money would include things like after-school programming, teacher development, and academic support programs, things that are sorely needed in African American communities and have actually had good outcomes, particularly after-school programs. And we know that African American students are more likely to be taught by teachers with less experience. So teacher development is also key. However, this administration planned to cut $8.5 billion from the budget, and that would include some of those programs. Now, one of the most important things for African Americans moving forward will be housing, both affordable housing and home ownership. So let's take a look at what the candidates say and what their records say on housing. Now, on housing, Vice President Biden declares that he will invest $100 billion in affordable housing, and for first-time home buyers, they will receive $15,000 in federal down payment assistance. So you will be able to buy your home if you are a first-time home buyer with the assistance of the federal government, something that actually kept African Americans from building wealth for many years. Of course, we know the FHA did not allow or did not give funding or back loans to African Americans between 1934 and 1964. It created the American middle class and it left African Americans behind. He's trying to do a little something to actually level the playing field here. Now, let's just say housing is not Donald Trump's strong point. We now have the lowest African American home ownership level since 1970. We know that home ownership is the largest asset that most Americans will own in their lifetime. And we know that home ownership is how one builds wealth. However, it has not worked out well. This administration has not worked out well for African Americans. Donald Trump would cut $3.2 billion from public housing. And according to Politico, the budget also calls for the adoption of a legislative proposal the administration floated in 2018 to overhaul rental assistance, in part by raising recipients' rent contributions from 30% to 35% of their monthly income. Now, Donald Trump in general seems to have some sort of disdain for HUD, and he would cut $8.6 billion from housing and urban development. Now we get to talk about what many of you have wanted to talk about probably while you've been watching this video, and that is criminal justice and criminal justice reform. This is somewhere where you can see a little bit of parity. They both have problems. Of course, Donald Trump has some issues, as does Joe Biden. And Joe Biden certainly has a longer record. So we'll go through and talk about what their plans are for the future and what they've accomplished up to this point. Now, when it comes to Joe Biden and criminal justice, we could go back as far as 1982, maybe even farther. We're going to start with something that may have caused mass incarceration altogether, and that is the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986, which established mandatory minimum sentencing. He also wrote the controversial Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act, H.R. 3355, also known as the 94 Crime Bill. Now, I will say that that bill is very misunderstood. It's a behemoth bill. There's so much in it. It deserves a more nuanced discussion than it often gets. And many people don't even know the actual name of it. But we'll save that for another video. Just say that it does have some controversial things. Of course, adding more police on the street and many of the other issues that it had in terms of juvenile justice. It was a very problematic law that Joe Biden wrote himself. It is important to note that many of the most controversial parts of the bill were things that he outwardly opposed at the time. And that is, of course, the 3 strikes provision, which was pushed for by Bill Clinton. But Joe Biden actually called that wacko. Bernie Sanders did not support that as well. We also have to remember that the Violence Against Women Act was also a part of that bill. Would have been very difficult to oppose. So I'm saying that on behalf of people that we're not even talking about who voted for it. But Joe Biden was the person who wrote the bill, and it was very problematic and caused lots of problems. But I would actually point back to his support for the Anti-Drug Abuse Act as being what drove mass incarceration. Now, how does he plan to remedy some of the problems that he actually helped to cause? Now, he plans to eliminate mandatory minimum sentencing. He wants the Department of Justice to address police misconduct. We know that's been a major issue, particularly with COVID-19 and the way that communities are policed in terms of social distancing and the wearing of masks. It's been completely different and racialized and based on class, and we've seen this with our own eyes. He also plans to invest in public defenders. Now, this is something that I think is so underrated and very important. And I think the Biden campaign, if they really want to make inroads with African American communities, they need to talk about the fact that they're going to invest in public defenders. Anyone who knows a public defender or someone who has used a public defender knows that public defenders basically have one objective, and that is to get you a deal. And that is because their caseloads are so large, they oftentimes are dealing with people who may not even comprehend the charges against them. They are dealing with people from all walks of life, some with severe mental disabilities. And they are just trying to get a deal on the table because they really don't have the time to fight a case. If we can invest more in public defenders and give people the opportunity to get a solid defense, and in some cases actually go to trial, not try to get deals, not try to get people to cop pleas when in fact they may not be guilty, this would really help a whole lot of people. When we look at some of the cases, even probably some of the death penalty cases, you're dealing with poor people who can't afford their own attorneys. They use court-appointed attorneys, and they are struggling. So him saying that he is going to invest in public defenders, and one of the things that Joe Biden can say that many others cannot say is that he is a former public defender. And that's pretty important. And of course adds a little bit more nuance to his record, which in many respects is poor. He does have the fact that he defended some of those poor people as a public defender. Now, he wants to end cash bail. Now, when you look at Biden's plans on how to end cash bail across the country, he's very scant on the details. Doesn't really say how that's going to happen. He says it's an objective. I think we need to push for more details. And he wants to enfranchise the formerly incarcerated and give them access to things like SNAP and Pell Grants and other things that other poor people are eligible for. Something that Bill Clinton allowed to happen, and Joe Biden, was a part of, was allowing them to amend the Higher Education Act, keeping federal funds away from people who were formerly incarcerated. It gave them few options and led to high recidivism. Now, in 2020, Joe Biden apparently sees the error of his ways, and he wants to change that. Now, when we look at Donald Trump's record on criminal justice, the First Step Act is something that he will tout throughout this election. And the First Step Act was very important. It reduced sentences for some drug offenses and has led to the release of at least 5,500 inmates by the making of this video. It's been something that many people have praised. It was a bipartisan piece of legislation, but Donald Trump did sign it, and it was important that he and others like Jared Kushner were involved in the drafting of the First Step Act. Now, with that, we also have to talk about, of course, the Central Park 6. Many people say Central Park 5. That's not completely accurate, and I will explain that later. But something that Donald Trump said about teenagers, including my very good friend who was 15 years old at the time in Harlem, a young man by the name of Steve Lopez, who's now a grown man and a father. Donald Trump put an ad in every major New York City newspaper and said they should be forced to suffer. And when they kill, they should be executed for their crimes. By the way, in the Central Park case, no one died. They must serve as examples for their crimes. They must serve as examples so that others will think long and hard before committing a crime or an act of violence. Now, he was saying this about teenagers who, of course, were later exonerated and did not commit that crime that they were accused of. But what you hear in those words is essentially a call for a lynching. He also ended Obama's ban on federal use of private prisons that profit off of inmate labor. He ended consent decrees, which were working to establish better relationships between African American communities and the police. We know that there's been decades of mistrust. Consent decrees were coming along to better that situation, make it so that African Americans felt comfortable around the police, try to have more community policing, and Donald Trump came along and wiped it out. Now, there are a couple other things that I think are really important. Of course, there are going to be some things that we don't get to, the opportunity zones of the Trump administration, some other things that Biden is planning in terms of small businesses that I think are really important, but we're not going to get to it because we want to keep this video short. I also wanted to talk about environment. I think that's incredibly important and something that's oftentimes overlooked. And Biden wants to monitor drinking water and hold polluters accountable. I think that's really important. Trump has reduced environmental protections. Biden will require companies to disclose their workforce and senior level diversity. He will encourage giving grants to localities that implement evidence-based practices like ban the box that are intended to make the workplace more diverse. I couldn't find anything that Trump was doing on that level. And Republicans generally are not advocating for diversity or measures that may lead to more diversity. And lastly, if there were few, if any, high-level Black Trump Organization employees. So while Biden, on the one hand, is looking to have more diversity in the workplace, Trump can't even claim that for his own organization, particularly when we're talking about senior level executives. And in addition, he had the least diverse first cabinet since the Reagan administration. And I think that that's also important. Some people, when we talk about education, are going to point back to the fact that I didn't mention vouchers. I think that vouchers are not necessarily something that can clearly be stated as a benefit to the Black community or Black communities. So that's why I left that out. There's a lot of debate around it. You are free to go and look up and see how it is that you feel about it. But I do think environmental protections, criminal justice reform, and other education measures are clearly to the benefit of African American communities and also housing. And, if we were to talk about small businesses, Trump has a claim to that as well. But I think Biden is coming along and saying that he can offer even more. Now, the big claim that the Trump administration is going to make is to African American unemployment being at its lowest level on record prior to COVID-19. And while that is true, we have to understand that that was not the result of any targeted policy. That was the result of unemployment dropping down since 2010 during the Obama administration, all the way through the Trump administration. And as a matter of fact, we saw that it dropped farther under the Obama administration. However, Trump has done a very good job of marketing and selling that talking point. It was, again, not the result of any kind of targeted policy towards African Americans. And as a matter of fact, it is just the remnant of our economic recovery that happened under the Obama administration, which Joe Biden also has claim to. So it'll be interesting to see who is able to effectively argue that they did more for African American unemployment. But more importantly, I think Charlemagne the God, we don't agree on everything. But one of the things that he said was that he wasn't really interested in the comments that Joe Biden made or even the comments that Donald Trump made. The big issue is what is on their Black agenda. But I would add, for future elections, we shouldn't wait for candidates to give us their agenda. We should give them our agenda and put it up for sale. Say we had 13 items on the agenda. Donald Trump says he'll take 8. Joe Biden says he'll take 10. Then you vote Biden, or vice versa. One of the things African Americans have to do that Malcolm X said long ago was to vote as a special interest group. And I agree with all of the people who are saying that. My problem is that they're not taking an active role in that. They're waiting for people to offer them something rather than creating their own agenda. So while I understand with Diddy saying that he's holding the black vote hostage, one of the things I would ask Diddy is, why don't you hold a conference every 2 to 3 years of an administration, talk about the progress that's been made, or vice versa, something that wasn't done, the problems that have arisen, and have this conference be a place where you can hammer out an actual agenda. And Diddy can do that. He has his television network. He obviously has the resources. Rather than just going on Twitter and going on Instagram and going on television shows and talking about this, let's create the actionable items. And no, I don't mean a conference with a bunch of celebrities to get views. I'm talking about an actual conference where you have academics, policymakers, and others who actually know what's at stake, know about policy, and know how to make those things happen. Hopefully, unfortunately, I've been looking for it. I can't find Diddy's number, so if somebody wants to hit him up, that'd be great. But in the meantime, you can hit me up in the comments. You can hit me on Twitter at RealDocSeuss, or I will see you on television and see you in the different places that I am. You certainly should subscribe to the Other Underground Railroad tour, and we will try to continue to give you good, informative content. Thank you so much.